Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Choi. I'm the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition. I want to thank the Shanker Institute for inviting me to speak here on this panel with some amazing panelists. I'm actually think there's a tremendous crossover in some of the things that they said and some of the things that I'm going to say too. First, I'm going to ask you all for a favor. I was part of a Twitter town hall yesterday, and after that, my comms person told me that I need to step up my Twitter game and take a selfie everywhere I go. So I'm going to ask you all to bear with me as I take a selfie here with all of you as well. There we go. Thank you. And it's supports ELL, is that right? Supports ELL. Okay. Got it. So the New York Immigration Coalition is an umbrella advocacy and policy coalition. We have about 175 member agencies all across New York State. And a lot of our member agencies are small grassroots community organizations. Some are large service providers. We have organized labor, business, academic institutions. So we have a very diverse membership. And this membership of organizations serves New York State's immigrant population. There's about 4.3 million immigrants in New York State. And about 3 million of those are in New York City. But that means that more than 1 million immigrants live in areas outside of New York City. That means they live in Long Island, Westchester, other parts upstate. And it's a drastically different environment in those areas. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today is what are some of the issues for English language learners, both in an immigrant-heavy place like New York City, but then also in some of these other areas outside of major, well-known immigrant gateway cities, where a lot of the growth is happening. A lot of the growth is happening, and immigrants are not coming directly to a New York City or a Chicago or a Los Angeles. They're going to other places. Without that kind of history of being known as this immigrant-friendly place like a New York City. So that's a real challenge, and I'm going to talk about what does it mean to deal with English language learner students, both in the context of a large city and outside of that. And I do want to say that I think, both what Professor DeJong mentioned and what Joe mentioned are totally in line. And we didn't plan this, but I think a lot of my talking points really are the same. And I see this from this kind of advocacy and policy perspective and a political perspective as opposed to the kinds of perspectives that they represent. So it's good to see that we're all on the same page. And I think that the bottom line that I would say is that if we want to create the right conditions for ELLs to succeed, either in a big city like New York City or outside of that, the key thing that I think we need to do is we need to change the dynamic politically. That the political piece of this can't be the last thing that we are talking about, but it's got to be the first thing. Because it is only by changing the political atmosphere and the dynamic and emphasizing ways in which everybody understands that immigrants are a value, that they are an asset, that they are a positive thing, and all the different things that they bring to the table are things that we should be welcoming into our communities and not seeing as a burden. If we're able to create that kind of atmosphere and that kind of understanding, then that I think really paves the way for families to be included, for students to be supported. And I just want to emphasize that I think that is the fundamental thing that we need to start addressing, because a lot of these other things will really flow from that. So in New York City, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 million immigrants living inside New York City, and they make up about 40% of the population. And when you add in immigrants and their direct offspring, it's nearly 2/3 of the city's population. And there's about 500,000 families in New York City that speak a language other than English at home. So the number of English language learner students, ELL students in New York City is vast. I do think that in New York City, there is a relatively large amount of resources and interest for ELL students. And in some places, it's almost become like cliche. It's almost become fashionable. Like, oh yeah, I send my kid to a dual language, Mandarin and English school. Well, I think it masks the reality. And the reality is that there continue to be major issues in educating ELL students in New York City. And their graduation rates reflect this. Their graduation rates are far behind that of their native English-speaking peers. And so we have a lot to do in terms of working with ELL students. And I would actually say that in a place like in an immigrant-heavy place like New York City, I think one of the keys is to leverage their families and their parents and think about them as assets. Because I think in a lot of ways, if you're able to tap in to the power of 500,000 immigrant families whose probably most major concern is the well-being of that of their children, then that becomes a humongous resource, and that's really untapped in so many ways. And I think in a lot of ways that can and should be the focus of a lot of work in immigrant-heavy places like New York City. So there is actually a video that I wanted to show that it's a really short clip of a larger video that we made, but it talks about a campaign that we launched. And we launched a campaign called Build the Bridge. And we have an education collaborative of organizations that are working with parents and kids in a lot of different diverse immigrant communities in New York City. And what was happening was that the Department of Education in New York City, they have regulations on the books that say that they need to be providing language access for the parents. And that's what the law says, but they were not following the law. And so we had all these ridiculous situations where teachers couldn't speak to the parents of the kids that they were talking to because they didn't have access to translators. They weren't able to schedule them. They didn't know what resources were there. Whatever resources were there were only available 9 to 5, but all these immigrant parents are, working like 8 to 8, right? So we had situations where, this one reporter came up to me and said, my husband is a teacher, and he asks me sometimes to translate into Spanish for the parents of the kids that I teach. And I said, that's ridiculous. Like, this is the New York City Department of Education. Like, there are no resources. And she's like, there are no resources like that. So part of it is about really building the resources, but part of it is also educating the Department of Education and working with them to have teachers, administrators, and parents all understand that there are resources out there to connect each other. So this is really what the video is about, that particular campaign.
We've been dealing with a problem with language access within schools, and that also decreased parents' engagement in their kids' school education.
It's all right. It's all right. Translation is all right.
The solution was brainstorming with NYIC, and with a collective effort, we were able to come up with an ask, and that ask was, we need language coordinators in the different borough.
My kids is my future, so the language is very important to me to understand, what my kids learn and how I can speak the teacher, the office, read the paper from the school.
And in January, it was a big win. The Department of Education gave us this win, which is provide 9 language coordinators. We couldn't have done this by ourselves. It was so much more powerful for us to be part of this larger coalition that brought many voices to one table.
That's a very short clip of a larger video, but I think it illustrates the fact that that engaging parents and families as resources and thinking about them as key levers that school systems can work with. And I mean, these parents want to work with schools. They want to work with the teachers, and they want to be engaged in their kids' education. And if you're not utilizing them and the strengths that they bring, then I think you're really missing out on a huge opportunity. Outside of New York City, it's a vastly different situation. And there, I would actually argue that really focusing on thinking about these kinds of L kids and these immigrant kids, refugee kids, and the strengths that they bring is really important. A lot of times, when you look at school districts in New York State that are outside of New York City, a lot of students are refugees. They're coming from places that are like Burma, or Bhutan, or Eritrea, Somalia, and they're literally refugees, and they could be of high school age. And what we find is that, especially in places that are smaller school districts, smaller rural or suburban school districts, with no real history of engaging immigrant communities, these school districts simply don't know how to react. And so what they'll do is they'll try to, sometimes they'll try to deny these students entrance into the school systems. Sometimes they will shunt them off into special education schools or special education classes that are outside of the normal education mainstream. In fact, there's over 20 school districts across New York State that have had to, that the state attorney general has basically gone to them and said, we're going to sue you if you keep on engaging in these practices because you're not allowed to do that. There's a constitutional obligation that you have to be educating these students, getting them into the mainstream. And so, they've had to enter into agreements with the state attorney general, Eric Schneiderman, because this kind of action has been happening. And I just want to note that, beyond the legality of this, I think there really is a moral component of this as well. And, and I'll touch upon this a little bit later. I mean, there's discrimination and there's ignorance, but the fact is that beyond simply some of those factors that I think both Professor DeJong and Joe mentioned, a lot of these kids are the most motivated to be learning. I mean, they're coming from war-torn countries where it was hard just to simply make a living or stay alive. And now if they're given the right kinds of opportunities, we can see the right kinds of supports, we can see the potential that they have to become incredibly high achievers and real contributors to society. And I just want to note that the unaccompanied minor issue, in a lot of ways, is a real is a real lens upon that, where in New York we have about 5,000 to 7,000 unaccompanied minor children who are coming. The great majority are going to school districts in Long Island, and many of these school districts have responded by, with a residency requirement. So, your parent or something like that has to have had residency in a long time. Well, these unaccompanied minors are coming without parents, so, it's a complete constitutional violation. So. I think that the thing that I want to note is that a lot of these school districts' response has been, some of the responses have simply been to say, we don't want these kids here, we're going to figure out how to keep them out. But some of the school districts, Utica, for example, has come back and said, it's not that we don't want these students here, but we just don't have the money, we don't have the support services. It's going to require a lot of money for translators, for bilingual teachers, and we just simply don't have the money to begin with for the students that we already have. And I don't think that that's an argument that we need to completely dismiss. So what do we need to do? Of course, we need to make sure that the folks who are in charge, that administrators and school principals and district heads need to understand, obviously, that ELs should have the support that they need, that there are laws to follow, and that we need, school districts should not be engaging in any kind of illegal ways to deny EL students access. There's no doubt about that. Like we need to really attack that and fight that when we see that happening. And there is an element of racism in some of these actions, there's no doubt about it. But there also is a large number of folks who are coming at it from the perspective of, well, we don't have the resources and we don't know how to deal with them, and these kids are going to cost a lot of money that we don't have. And I would argue that really thinking about these immigrants from a larger perspective, and not just these kids, but I think it is a project that we need to undertake, a political project that we need to undertake to change the tenor of the conversation, away from building walls, away from banning Muslims, but thinking about immigrants as assets and not as deficits. And this is something that my co-panelists have talked about. If we're able to change the dynamic and the kind of rhetoric that's going on, and we are able to fully understand all the benefits that immigrants and immigrant EL students bring to the table, all the cultural benefits that they bring, the perspective that they bring as different students from different countries, the economic benefits that they bring that Professor DeJong mentioned, immigrant communities can be assets. And the more that we are able to have communities all across the United States understand that as a fundamental value, and we need to really engage the larger community around this. And this is something that's going to take the effort of the business community, the labor community, local and state governments, and the native-born community. We need to figure out better ways to engage native-born Americans and have them be the vanguard of a lot of this work instead of just immigrants themselves on an island. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to turn the conversation, that in turn, I believe, will start to build the political will for the services and the support that we need to really unlock the potential of EL students all across this country. And if we're able to do that, then the resources will be understood as not just a cost that we have to incur, but an investment in the future of our communities to thrive economically and socially and culturally. And so that is the last thing that I wanted to say.